I don't think it's a well-guarded secret at this point that I have a massive fascination for zone punk. Stories revolving around abandoned, post-catastrophic areas of dilapidation that are the silent witnesses of bygone prosperity of better days. When it comes to video games, the Stalker series stands front and center in this category with its unmistakable identity of post-Soviet junk punk, transforming the soul of Strugatsky's Roadside Picnic into a one-of-a-kind, open-world, Eurojank, Gopnik Counter-Strike RPG. And it worked fabulously. And despite years of hope and speculation around a potential successor, which might finally bear fruit in the coming year if all goes according to plan, in the meantime, for many people, the Metro series became Stalker's successor in spirit, which, despite initially shifting away from its open-world design, carried the post-Soviet zone punk torch on after Call of Pripyat. But while this is undoubtedly true for various reasons, there is one heavily overlooked, equally Ukrainian-made gem that had already delivered many of the signature Stalker-inspired rustic Slavic zone shooter elements which would eventually become staples for Metro's trademark tone, texture, and narrative-heavy game feel, 2 years before Metro 2033 even hit the shelves. I'm talking about Action Form's psychological horror shooter Cryostasis. But while Metro grew into a successful, long-running IP, which spawned 3 major titles and multiple technical remasters of the past decade, Cryostasis wasn't nearly as lucky after its release in 2008 in Russia and 2009 in the rest of the world. For one, it came out as a poorly optimized, hardware-hungry resource eater that brought even cutting-edge computers of the time to their knees, and it was released at a time when mainstream FPS audiences were in the middle of heavily transitioning into the post-modern warfare craze. And to add insult to injury, Cryostasis developer studio faced non-arbitrable legal differences with its publisher 1C Company, which ultimately saw the game removed from retail and digital storefronts swiftly after its launch, so that it remains, up to this day, a notably difficult game to attain. So in this video, I want to travel far up north with you, to revisit the spine-chilling horror trip into the frosty remains of the icebound nuclear icebreaker Northwind, and make you aware what an overlooked gem bursting with potential Cryostasis really is. A game that could have been a highly influential piece of shooter history, had the stars been aligned just ever so slightly differently. Alright, before we go on, I'd like to express my thanks to Core for sponsoring the making of this video. So in return, let me show you what they've got to offer to you. Now, by far one of the best pieces of advice for people who dream of making their own games is, do not start out by working on your big passion project. Make and finish a bunch of small projects first. Because without actual experience in planning, structuring, executing, and especially releasing games, your dream project will suffer under it and probably end up on the never-ending landfill of perished video game ambitions. Which is one of the big reasons I'm so fascinated by Core. It's a platform that enables you, without coding, art, or development experience, to start turning your ideas into games, like now, without hitting a brick wall. Core provides an intuitive, easy-to-use Unreal Engine-powered toolset designed to get you impressive, playable results in record time, with a vast amount of completely free assets, templates, behaviors, and even a reliable, out-of-the-box multiplayer system. And the coolest part is, you can release your creation to a vast community of like-minded creators and playtesters pretty much at the click of a button. Boom, it's that simple. And then you can explore and play the thousands of games created by Core's active community of passionate developers at your leisure, completely free of charge. If for creating or for playing, I say give it a shot. And if you do, you'd help me out in the process if you use the link I've provided in the description to let them know that was actually me who sent you over. Thanks a lot again, and now I hope you enjoy the rest of the video. Not that long ago, I've been watching AMC's excellent historical fiction horror series, The Terror, which revolves around the infamous Franklin expedition in the 19th century in which two Royal Navy ships attempted to force the Northwest Passage across the Arctic Ocean and ended up permanently stuck in the unrelenting pack ice for multiple years until every last man perished in the hostile environment, lacking adequate clothing and nutrition. It's an incredibly fascinating setting by itself, and the show fictionalized the story with a subtle cosmic horror twist, which is just a damn good choice for a spine-chilling horror story about a hubristic human endeavor that's gradually succumbing to despair in the wake of an untamable eldritch force of nature. It almost feels like the obvious choice, doesn't it? A pitch-perfect combination of tropes, which, watching the series captivated by its unique blend of despair, coldness, and cosmic horror, made me think of Cryostasis. Because Action Form's 2008 horror shooter apparently came to the very same conclusion. The eternal ice is a prime setting for Lovecraftian storytelling. Although this one is set a good while later than The Terror. You assume the role of Alexander Nesterov, an expeditionary meteorologist who's meeting up with the Arctica-class Soviet nuclear-powered icebreaker Northwind in the Arctic Circle in order to hitch a ride home after his expedition. But upon arrival, you get separated from your trusty sled dogs by a massive frostquake, and you find the giant ship mysteriously forlorn and trapped in the pack ice, and you're left no choice but to enter the derelict vessel through a large gaping hole in the ship's hull. Within the first minutes of your sojourn in the frozen bowels of the dilapidated corpse of the Sea Hulk, you find its corridors torn to shreds by pressure ridges. Trails of destruction streak through the interior, caused by floods frozen solid, and heavy steel girders, walls, and corridors bent and broken by the unrelenting force of the ship's icy grave. It is a corroded, post-disaster landscape that has conserved the story of its downfall for the player in permafrost. Whatever went down here, it doesn't take long for you to read the environment like a book and find how the ship's crew must have been gripped by unspeakable panic and fear and eventually turned on each other in utter despair. Cryostasis is phenomenal at telling the story of the downfall of the Northwind through its environments. Not long after you enter the vessel, you discover that our protagonist possesses a unique empathic skill through which he experiences and partakes in the memory of the ship's catastrophe firsthand. When you eventually stumble across cryopreserved corpses of crew members, you sense a warm, pulsating source of energy radiating from their heart chakras. And when you reach out and touch them, you find yourself transported into their last moments before their demise. But instead of passively observing their tragic deaths like a film reel, you yourself are in control of the situation. One of the game's central objectives is to find the remains of the ship's crew and correct their fatal mistakes in the wake of a catastrophe much grander than themselves. By essentially fixing what went wrong in the past, the effects that their deaths had caused are altered, reverted to a better state where everything went as it was supposed to. Which, for instance, turns a flooded, frozen, and therefore impassable basement free from the ice filling that prevented us from passing through before, and we can proceed now where we couldn't just a minute ago. And besides fixing structural problems, our intervention into the mental echoes of the unlucky crew members helps their restless souls finally find solace and peace. It makes the player an interesting hybrid between a passive observer and an active interventionist force. Cryostasis' mental echoes are a clever and inventive approach at diegetic exposition, not that unsimilar to, for instance, how Pillars of Eternity answered the age-old video game storyteller's question of, how do I fill the audience in on my complex backstory without it feeling like boring info dump and make it an organic element of the very world? And honestly, considering that this game is made by a Slavic developer studio and portrays a cataclysmic event of soul-crushing despair, your role as an agent of hope in this is a surprisingly sweet and kind-hearted twist. But of course, cuddling tormented souls of dead seamen is not the only thing you do in Cryostasis. The game is, after all, a first-person shooter, and the shooty parts not just take place during Mental Echoes, but also doing your own traversal of the lost vessel's innards in the present. You find yourself repeatedly stalked and attacked by manic, mutated crew members who try to make you dead with whatever they have available, from bare knuckles and axes up to heavy firearms like rifles and machine guns. Those adversaries you face feel like deep-frozen, undead, physical manifestations of the crew's internal strife with their inner demons as they slowly succumb to madness and mutated into Lovecraftian horrors. And despite this deeply psychological horror backdrop and a host of impressive set pieces and spine-chilling suspense moments, the lion's share of Cryostasis' moment-to-moment gameplay feels very much like a grade A representative of the final phase of the mid to late 2000s shooter era in which Half-Life was still the dominant blueprint when it comes to first-person story design. It is, in many ways, a classic Die Hard scenario.
Come out to the coast, we'll get together, have a few laughs.
So where Half-Life was a Die Hard in a desert research complex, Cryostasis is Die Hard on a ship. Well, okay, that's under siege.
Flavor.
So it's more like Die Hard on a nuclear icebreaker. The story is told in one continuous POV narrative that's never chronologically interrupted between sequences, with the exception of the Mental Echoes if you want to be pedantic, but it's still uninterrupted in Alexander's perception. And in best Valve tradition, especially looking at Half-Life 2's gravity gun here, it's a prime example of the mid to late 2000s penchant for exploring the possibilities of in-game physics and building its gameplay around one central, never-before-seen technical gimmick. In Cryostasis, the technological protagonist is its ice and water propagation system. For instance, fluidly rendered water, when exposed to sub-zero temperatures, subsequently reacts and freezes, which can make areas impassable, while ice-covered surfaces and hanging icicles melt and even burst apart under pressure or when exposed to heat sources in the vicinity. The game is, still up to this day, visually really impressive with its use of realistic PBR shaders that believably render different aggregate states in different temperatures, like melting ice water pouring down the ship's heavy steel walls and doors. It was both one of its most noteworthy, but also one of the game's most demanding features, as Cryostasis was rather poorly optimized, so much so that even cutting-edge computers at the time weren't able to play the game in full resolution and at full frame rate at all. Which is a damn shame, because it was not just a neat gimmick, but Action Forums committed fully to embrace the theme of coldness and design multiple core gameplay mechanics to purposefully revolve around it. Most prominently, in Cryostasis you don't have a traditional health bar, but your life is represented by your character's body warmth. The game's heads-up display features a thermometer that measures both the temperature of your immediate surroundings as well as your own body heat. The colder your surroundings, the faster your body temperature drops. You lose life energy by being out in the icy cold, which can become really intense when you, for instance, leave the inside of the ship with blizzards freezing you to death in just a few heartbeats. So to replenish your quote-unquote health, you have to seek out all kinds of heat sources that radiate healing warmth and take that moment of rest to heat yourself up. Radiators, hot water pipes, lamps, and all kinds of appliances suddenly become desired and much sought-after objects of regeneration. Cryostasis designers went a long way to create game mechanics that make you feel the unrelenting coldness of the game's setting on your own skin. As much as a game you can play in a warm room with a nice cup of hot coffee right next to you can possibly manage. And conversely, these cold mechanics have the fascinating effect that you explore and perceive your surroundings with completely different eyes. Your feelers are always out for areas and objects that appear exceedingly cold, while you're equally perpetually scouting for things that could be warm enough to replenish some of your body heat. No, seriously, how often in a game do you really look at lamps? Not just think, oh wow, damn great lighting here, but actually pay attention to what kind of bulb a light source is employing. In Cryostasis, you'll intuitively learn the temperature difference between a cold fluorescent light tube and a brightly emanating incandescent tungsten bulb in no time. Forget medkits. The desk lamp is where the joy's at. And hey, steak sizzling on a hot stove? I'm all here for it, but I don't care one bit for the dead meat. Give me that sweet, succulent thermal energy straight into my veins. It is a feature that sometimes creates these wonderful, organically tense situations. Starved of warmth after a long stretch in the icy cold, the potential encounter with a lurking adversary can feel genuinely intimidating. Which, okay, it is a bit funny that getting shot in this game basically only makes you colder, not wounded or anything. But hey, I'll be damned if you don't find yourself at least once having developed severe tunnel vision due to being almost frozen to death, stumbling desperately towards a tantalizingly steaming pipe, and then find yourself completely taken by surprise by one of the many nasty ambushes that lie in wait exactly from where your mind is not paying attention right now. Cryostasis can be a mean son of a bitch of a game at times when it comes to this, which is a seal of quality. It is a horror game after all, isn't it? Cryostasis developer studio Action Forms is a prime example that, ever since first-person shooters have been around, the developers a bit further back in the hierarchy of public perception often try to draw attention to their games with unusual and interesting narrative approaches that you wouldn't get anywhere else. Action Form's earlier titles, like Chasm the Rift in 1999, their longest-running series of sci-fi Dino Hunter and Hunted shooters, Carnivores, as well as the still excellent semi-open-world sci-fi military shooter Vivisector Beast Within, are all games that try to deliver interesting narrative experiments with twists and quirks that you just wouldn't find like that on the beaten path of big AAA releases. And Cryostasis is not just no exception to this, it is, aside from their technical flexing, probably the most noteworthy for being Action Forms' narratively most ambitious game to date. It is every bit as much a dense and gripping Die Hard scenario as it is a Sub-Zero supernatural detective story set in one of the most intriguing settings I've come across in a first-person shooter. And a lot of it is crafted with, for an ego shooter of that era, meticulous research into the idiosyncrasies of the treacherous nature of Sub-Zero environments and the Arctic pack ice. And aside from trying to not get clubbed, axed, or shot to death, nor die of hypothermia, the biggest overarching task you'll engage in the game is trying to piece together the tale of what really happened aboard the Northwind retroactively. And although you do find various documents and audio recordings here and there, it feels rarely quite as ham-handed as in, I'm sorry, the vast majority of narrative-heavy immersive sims like Deus Ex or Bioshock, where seemingly every person that inhabited that world had neatly recorded or written down exactly the right snippets of information before their untimely demise and placed them precisely in the perfect place for a potential future video game protagonist to discover it in the most coherent order to form a chronologically sound retelling of the events.
Hey Brenda, you care to tell me why you've had a hole in the wall the size of Plymouth Rock coming out of your crapper going on 3 weeks now?
One of the main reasons for that is the narrative genius of Cryostasis' mental ecosystem, which makes the way Alexander encounters the bits and snippets of information feel like an integral part of the game's world, while still leaving the mystery opaque enough that it's a genuine challenge and takes quite a bit of time until the pieces start falling into place. The game is also excellent at establishing the physical space of the ship in a way that, despite being largely linear in presentation, makes you feel like you know the vessel inside out after its roughly 8 to 9 hour long story campaign. There are multiple instances where you encounter flashbacks that show critical moments from different points of view. It gives you a great sense of the relation of different people's roles in the story and feels genuinely satisfying when the fog of war in your mental map connects two previously separate places, and that happens multiple times, surprisingly well orchestrated. Was it all the fault of the irredeemable old captain who doesn't care about modern technology but swears on gut instinct gathered from decades at sea? Or was it the whimsical nature of his first lieutenant who doubts his intuition every step of the way? Or is the blame to place somewhere in between?
Here's a message from HQ for a start.
There are multiple areas of the game that don't even feature a single violent confrontation, but they are so neatly orchestrated and important for the unraveling of the overarching mystery that those sequences of turmoil we will live through the eyes of the crew feel, without exception, tense and gripping from start to finish. And no fights doesn't always mean no danger. After all,
this place wants us dead.
All of this makes Cryostasis a horror shooter with a surprisingly empathetic streak. Your goal is to save not just the souls, but the very fate of the derelict icebreaker and its unlucky ship's company. Because this feature of dipping back into the past bears grave consequences within the very fabric of time. The more we mess with fate, the more absurd and sinister the Lovecraftian abominations the seamen transform into become. From mutated mothmen that hatch from nests built out of solid ice, over those persistent, clankily stalking creepers on stilts who feel like the little brethren of Brother Mantid from the Void, to the iconic fiercely armored overseer juggernauts who announce their presence with blasting war sirens, pursuing the player even through walls while wielding two Papa Shahs akimbo. These guys feel like the hold my beer answer to Bioshock's Big Daddies, which, yeah, you could say that just like with Metro, Cryostasis was therefore also far ahead of the hotly anticipated Soviet Bioshock Atomic Heart. For what it's worth. Cryostasis, from start to finish, always has another narrative ace up its sleeve, so its just under 10-hour-long campaign never gets dull, boring, or feels too long. Because the deeper you dive into the flow of time, the more you anger even Kronos himself and draw him out of the void. And that makes things get weirder and weirder in an oddly enticing way. Cryostasis, and that is still striking 1.5 decades after its release, was an incredibly ambitious game, not just for its comparably small developer team. And it certainly doesn't succeed at everything it attempts, not by a long shot. But boy, does it attempt beautifully. It's one of the things I find genuinely charming and fascinating about it. And over the years, I've grown to understand that jank, a quality that's innately considered a bad thing, can oftentimes be an indicator that the developers cared first and foremost about creating something new, something off the safe route that's already been explored and iterated on many times over, or something that pushes boundaries with no guarantee that the hard work will bear fruit in the end. Where innovation mattered more than polish and perfect marketability. Cryostasis is a striking example for this philosophy of Eurojank. It comes along with many features that feel first and foremost interesting or technically impressive in a way that you can tell how much the devs loved working on and implementing them for ingenuity's sake without always bothering if it would actually add something redeemable to the gameplay or the overall experience. A perfect example is the scoped Mosin Nagant rifle. The telescopic sight, at all times, accurately renders the viewport from the exact position and direction of the scope, almost like a little mini smartphone screen in the corner there. It's a really neat technical knick-knack, and I can vividly envision the moment where the developer who implemented it screamed through the office something like, "Everyone come look, this is so cool!" And everybody was marveling about it, but I seriously wonder if anyone ever playtested this weapon because it is so horribly over-zoomed and due to the viewport rendering so pixelated when you aim down sights that it's next to impossible to orientate yourself when peeking through it. Not to mention that a 4 times amplified World War II sniper rifle designed to pick off targets several hundred meters away is a completely out-of-place choice weapon aboard a narrow and claustrophobic shipwreck where you'll rarely face anyone more than 5 to 10 meters away from you. But I guess, at the time, Enemy of the Gates was just so en vogue that you just couldn't imagine a Soviet-themed shooter without Vasily Zaitsev's signature boomstick. Or the brawling mechanics, which are surprisingly faceted. You have multiple different punch combos, uppercuts, jabs in various directions combined with blocking and dodging, double attacks, which makes you initially think this game is going to expand on this surprisingly complex melee fighting system, which would make it a very typical of its time mid-2000s brawler type FPS game a la Condemned or Riddick. But no. Once you get your hands on your first firearm after like the first hour or so, you pretty much have no real reason to ever get back to using your bare knuckles again. It's just dropped. Or another example for ingenuity with its setting through technological flexing is the icicle gun that you get somewhere around the midway point of the campaign. This weapon is loaded, filled up, with literal icicles hanging from walls and ceilings, which suddenly turns something that you before perceived as set dressing and sometimes maybe an obstacle in your way into a usable entity, which achieves that you will once again look at your surroundings in a completely new way. The cannon itself takes those frozen stalactites and melts them to a pressurized stream of water, stunning enemies in place, which turns out to be a surprisingly powerful weapon actually. But here's the kicker. If you're not sporting one of the long-deprecated line of dedicated NVIDIA physics graphics cards, you're missing out on many of the most impressive water, ice, and particle effects the game has to offer, including the Icicle Cannon's pressure stream, which, yeah, without it, makes the water ray feel like a 10-year-old's first discount Super Soaker. Which feels super dissonant and almost laughable when it effortlessly washes an Overseer away, the strongest enemy in the game, without you taking the least bit of damage, when it looks like you're just making him a bit wet on a kid's birthday in summer. This is a great example for why Cryostasis was a game that, in many ways, failed on the shoulders of other parties' responsibility. The publisher, as I mentioned, marketed the game disappointingly poorly and ultimately tore it from shelves and digital storefronts in the wake of petulant copyright disagreements. And at the same time, the NVIDIA Physics project turned out to be a commercial misfire in the long run. It had promised a new era of never-before-seen destructibility, particle effects, propagation, and fluid simulation effects in video games. And while the technology was there and impressive, and it was also carried on, it was ultimately a grave miscalculation on how the market would embrace it be tied to very specific hardware exclusive to NVIDIA. Ignoring the fact that limiting the shiny, standout versions of new benchmark titles to exclusively NVIDIA's flagship hardware. Neither enough game studios nor the audience did embrace this blatant attempt at proprietizing graphical excellence remotely as much as NVIDIA had anticipated. And the ones who ultimately paid most dearly for it were the developers who gave it their everything. Cryostasis is one of the most ambitious showcase projects for NVIDIA's physics SDK at the time, with Action Forums pulling no punches to make sure the use of physics in their game not just technically but also gameplay-wise outstanding. But in hindsight, it was another shovel of dirt on the game's shallow grave. At the time, as a game that was already aimed at a rather niche audience, would only be able to present itself in its best light on a very select range of gaming PCs that were equipped with one of the rare physics-featuring GPUs installed. Everyone else did not only have to play it in a much less visually impressive version, they were also likely to experience with lackluster performance at best. But it is also an absolute bane for the long-term preservation of games as a historic artifact. These days, 13 years after its launch, most common mid-range PCs are more than strong enough to run the game without any performance issues, even on highest settings. But since the proprietary hardware-based physics SDK generation has long been deprecated, before it became open source and available for everyone, those games that relied on specific hardware for those effects aren't even backwards compatible with newer generations of GPUs. There's pretty much no way to play the game on a modern PC the way it was meant to be played, without turning into Hacker Man. It's a perfect point-in case for the fact that proprietary takeover always hurts video games as an artistic medium, plain and simple. Cryostasis went a long way to employ a technically promising system admirably and ended up left in the dirt for it. And that's a damn shame, because this surprisingly empathetic psychological horror shooter with a little more luck in distribution and marketing could have easily ended up remembered as a true cornerstone that pushed shooter design into a new direction. It's a title that deserves to be preserved, and it's more than worth going through some extra effort to experience it for yourself, even if you have to resort buying it from one of those shady key resellers to snag a copy, which is still the easiest way to activate it on Steam these days. Until then, it will remain a forgotten gem that I'll silently and fondly reminisce about every once in a while when a more recent title pulls something off everyone can't stop gushing about that I know Cryostasis has beaten it to the punch with by many years.
How could I hope to change the world if I didn't start with myself? If I had to change at least one man, let it be me.
Thank you so much for watching. I hope I could pique your interest for this beautiful, ice-cold and rusty Slavic shooter gem, and if you'd like to get a hold of it, as I said, your best options, since it's not available to buy at any digital reseller at this moment, are either buying a used physical copy or acquiring a key from a reseller, because since the game has been listed on Steam in the past, you can still activate it and then you'll own it until Steam eventually closes down. If this was your first video of mine on my channel, I strongly focus on covering old and forgotten games, horror games, indie games, or combinations thereof. Now, for a while I've been thinking about using my credit sequences here to shed some light on indie games that I think are absolutely worth checking out that people might have overlooked otherwise. So today I'm gonna give this a trial run. The gameplay you're currently seeing in the background is my first run of Hrot, a Quake-inspired boomer shooter set in Czechoslovakia in the final throes of the Soviet Union after an unspecified disaster in 1986. So thematically quite in line with a video on a first-person rustic Slavic zonepunk shooter, don't you think? The game just released about a month ago and it is fantastic, and if you like what you see, you should absolutely check it out. It's available on Steam. The work on these videos and the support of everyone who partakes in it is in big parts crowdfunded, and if you'd like to help me cover more forgotten and overlooked games in the future, why not consider dropping a buck or two over on my Patreon? Your continued support really makes all the difference, so thank you for considering. And today, my special immortalizing shout-out thank you goes to these wonderful people. Boris Bügling, Ty McCandless, Isabella Stoner, Corey Marr, Billy Lott, Kenan Ward, Alex Popov, Chuck Taylor, 9ball9606, Norbert Gerard Matinka, Dr. Haley Isabella Colley, Chris C., Malim, Federico Rocha, Agustin Ortega, Matt Gretton, Kerry George, Lex Reckless, Thwagam, Casper Ram, Swallowtail Knights, Max Macula, Faulty Gear, Cordelia Crescendo, Refkins, Contemplodum, Giselle Almonte, Hunter Crawford and Margaret Strawn, Shannon Blue, Lawrence E. Buben, Chris Jan, Shkotsky, Wong Vu, Laird Wakala, Starina Abramson, Ronan Crom aka Daniel242172, David Zelenak, Lilin B, Pablo Arcelus, Nikon the Brave, Fuka Princess, Christine, Ian Rhodes, Raul Blanco, Andrew Hines, Catherine Escobar, Terry Collins, Sophie Paulson, Kevin H. Yang, Jin Hansen, Dana Rosa, and Kelly Michelle Russell. Until next time, ta-ta!